Kia ora koto katoa. Welcome to CARE's 2026 lecture series on digital futures. For the second lecture of this series, it's a real pleasure to have with us Professor Pradip Thomas. Now, I have known Pradeep for a very long time. In fact, Pradeep is one of the key nodes of inspiration for a lot of my own work in development communication and what then evolved into communication for social change. He is one of the earliest proponents of the communication for social change framework and runs a really successful program in communication for social change at the University of Queensland. He is with the School of Communication and Arts at UQ. He has published extensively on the politics of data, the political economy of digital communications, particularly with a global South focus, and the politics of social change. I find his work on the digital and Hindutva, for instance, as one of the key go-to works in understanding the linkages between communication and the workings of far-right fascism in a global South context. His latest book, Data Center Entanglements, is forthcoming from Oxford University Press in 2026, is a critical intervention in the broader conversation on the digital. So, Pradeep, it's such a pleasure to have you with us and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much, Mohan. Let me just begin uh, with thanking you especially for this invitation. I'd like to commend the work that CARE does and the work that you do, because you are really a public intellectual, and I can see from your daily posts that you are speaking truth to power, and that's so important in the times that we live in. I'm going to begin today's presentation by trying to deal with this whole issue of digital futures, social justice, justice, all very problematic in the times that we live in. I mean, what is social justice in the face of the kind of evaporation, evisceration of a rules-based order? And the best example of that is this genocide in Gaza and the attacks on Iran. Or closer to home, the Queensland government's banning of pro-Palestinian slogans, right? It would seem that this rules-based human rights order that had been built in the aftermath of the Second World War is in real problems at the moment, right? We often kind of deal with the lineage of that tradition of this human rights order, and we take it back to people like George Washington and scholars like John Locke and others. But it would seem that it was built on a house of cards that kind of has tilted in the face of a few determined 21st century autocrats who had little time for the values of the Enlightenment or the freedoms that all of us living in democracies took for granted. So that is a reality. Perhaps democracy was always brittle and could easily be curbed and hemmed in, and that the freedoms associated with democracy could easily be compromised. Perhaps that was always the case. And I think it's pretty clear today that you have global hegemons by virtue of their brute economic power and control over global violence, break these rules willy-nilly, and they're not beholden to any overarching rules-based order. And I think in the context of the times that we live in, dissent is a casualty of the times, right? And this is why I commend Mohan again for the work that he does. Social justice is a casualty of ground zero. And we know the best example of this is the Trump administration and his dealings with this kind of breaking down of the architecture of a rules-based order. So that's an issue with social justice, and then of course we have that issue with the digital. Um, and we all live in a world in which we are enveloped by the digital. And the digital is material, it's immaterial, it's networked and global, but at the same time intensely local. And of course, it is key to the contemporary um, mode of production. Digital that is deeply implicated in contemporary hegemonic power. A digital that has enveloped the world in its kind of unilateral logic, and that has entangled all national governments in its very corrosive embrace. What will our digital futures be in the context of what would seem to be an unregulated approach to AI, and one in which a handful of big tech companies already command and control the rules for search, sociality, e-commerce, are involved in surveillance, sometimes along with the state. So I think in the context of looking at whether it's social justice or democracy, things do not look pretty even in the digital world. So my own work on digital justice has been focused on India most of the time, a country that I'm most familiar with. And here too, of course, as we well know, democracy has been compromised. And it is amazing to see the ways in which hate speech has become mainstreamed. And there's a kind of determination by some of these forces to take India back to a glorious past when the upper caste ruled, and when the minority is kind of treated as second-class citizens. I find it extraordinary that at the same time, another competing hegemon, China, has systematically used its social and cultural capital to strengthen its economic ambitions. And it's during, so you have China on the one hand marching ahead, and India wallowing in the imagined greatness of its past by attempting to transform myths into history and history into an excuse for creating a narrow, Savarna-centered, exclusive cultural and social order that exists at the expense of India's many diversities. Having said that, I think India's saving grace is that it has for centuries been a recipient of ideas, big ideas, religious, social, political. And these ideas have doggedly persisted in the context of a variety of centralized pressures, including recently electoral malfeasance, an open war against minorities, particularly Muslims, and the exercise of religious and cultural hegemonies on a grand scale, and all types of violence in the offline and online worlds. So it's interesting that this particular slide gives you information on those grand ideas, one of those grand ideas, or two of the grand ideas. In the context of Tamil Nadu, where I was born and brought up, rationalism and Dravidian politics I really is a bulwark against this kind of extreme religious ideologies that the government has pushed for in India. And in the neighboring state of Kerala, communism, both these ideologies have come under strain in recent weeks. Although the reality is that these strains are there and they are going to remain, right? So here's a photograph of the ex-chief minister of the state of Tamil Nadu, Stalin, and that's a good name, that paying homage to Marx on his anniversary. At the same time, there are any number of local voices online in different parts of the country. Mohan recently had put up a post on one of those local voices, Pujarini Pradhan. And it's fascinating to kind of hear her voice and what she has to say. And the fact that she's now competing with the kind of shrill majority of high caste influences. And of course, even in the online world, they play a role in gatekeeping. I recall Paulo Freire's words that the oppressed must also learn the dominant syntax in the fight against oppression. And I think this is exactly what Pujarini Pradhan is doing along with her other counterparts in different parts of the country. So I think one thing that needs to be made clear is that despite the kind of hegemonic tendencies in the country, and despite the fact that there's the government is pushing down its coercive power and stifling dissent, there are big ideas still floating around. There are still people making their voices heard. And that is the strength of the country. Right? No doubt, that is the strength of the country. So, with that as the background, I'm going to be dealing with 4 examples. Right? Now, but before I go into those examples, I'd like to begin with a kind of aside on political economists of communications, like myself. Now, political economists tend to be very pessimistic, right? And that's the problem with this is, of course, is that we are involved in bad news stories most of the time. And sometimes this has fatal consequences. And this slide really is about those fatal consequences. Some of our key scholars in political economy, critical political economy, Louis Althusser, for example, strangled his wife. Nikos Poulantzas committed suicide. And the Penn State professor Ron Bettig, who wrote the excellent Political Economy of Copyright, was murdered by his students. Right? And I knew Ron Bettig personally. So I'm determined to take a detour from these types of narratives to ennobling examples of digital justice. Right? So, yeah, so like I said, political economists tend to be very pessimistic, right? And it's really important that we also look at the positive side of things in the area of communications. So I'm going to be dealing with 4 examples, positive examples. The first one is going to be based on the free and open source movement, software movement in Kerala and alternatives in Kerala. That is an example of digital state-based digital justice. And then I'll deal with gig workers and social justice. That is really an example of digital worker rights, unions getting involved in that space. And the third example is going to be on community connectivity, and this is from a project called Janastu. That really is an example of connectivity as digital justice. And Janastu is based in a place called Tumkur in Karnataka. And the fourth and final example will be about data center activisms that are examples of community-based activisms against predatory big tech. So these examples are based on my own experiences of doing fieldwork in India over the last 2 decades and have all been described in journal articles and monographs. And I think we also need to keep in mind that the background to these 4 case studies are the extraordinary investments in kind of these technocratic projects, the kind of visions of India as a knowledge economy, the rollout of digital public infrastructures, right? And national level mission projects linked to the Indian stack, and the absolute technological determinism at the heart of these visions, at the kind of expense of investments in the amelioration of other divides that persist, right? Things like the need to regulate platforms and big tech in the public good, right? So that's the background, the fact that India has invested greatly in these technocratic visions, right? But the way I see it is that these technocratic visions are kind of one-size-fits-all solutions, right? Very imposed with no space for local people to kind of create infrastructures of their choice or environments, digital environments of their choice. So let me just begin with the first example, and that's the force-based um, alternatives in Kerala. So this project needs to be seen as a counter to edtech colonialism and the absolute control over the sector by specific software giants such as Microsoft, Microsoft Education, and of course the hegemony of software suites such as Microsoft Windows in areas highlighted by Bill Gates. And this is about Microsoft's colonization of university level computer science education, training for IT professionals, computer education in schools, and career oriented education. Right? All these have been colonized by Microsoft Education. Now, this vision that has triumphed in the rest of India was curtailed very early on in Kerala when Microsoft enforcement raids in schools using pirated software in Kerala precipitated collaborations between the Free Software Foundation of India and the Kerala State Teachers Association and hastened the move to force-based solutions. Kerala's story, however, stands in marked contrast to neighboring Tamil Nadu. And Tamil Nadu had this amazing software evangelist who was also a civil servant by the name of C. Umashankar, who was in charge of the Electronic Corporation of Tamil Nadu Limited, ELCOT. So Tamil Nadu, even by the 2010, 2011, they were involved in a free laptop program. And Umashankar was really keen that the free laptops are based on FOSS software. But it was because of major pressure from Microsoft, and I also believe a visit from Hillary Clinton, there was a complete change, and the operating system became Windows, right? So this happened in neighboring Tamil Nadu. So in 2009, while carrying out research on communication rights movements in India that eventually became the second book in a trilogy published by Sage, I was invited to attend a workshop on public sector software in Bangalore. And one of the key people at that workshop was Umashankar. And I was amazed at this kind of, false evangelist who was also a civil servant, one of these IAS type people in India. But interestingly enough, in Kerala, the government in Kerala, under the leadership of the then Chief Minister V.S. Achyutanandan, had already begun the process of mainstreaming FOSS in around 2000. Okay. The FOSS guru Richard Stallman, for example, had inaugurated the Free Software Foundation in Trivandrum in 2001. Kerala was the first state in India to adopt a pro-FOSS IT policy that was translated into the IT at Schools project that is now known as the Kerala Infrastructure and Technology for Education KITE project, that has been tasked with the rollout of FOSS-only solutions based on a custom-built Linux operating system in 16,000 government-funded schools. The Kerala government has also adopted FOSS as a preferred solution across numerous government sectors, a solution that has saved the state exchequer US dollars 350 million in license fees. The question really is, how come other states in India haven't followed suit? So what the Kerala government has been able to do is that it has been able to avoid vendor lock-in while enabling quality access through the customization and localization of software in the local language Malayalam. So they use, I quote, LibreOffice instead of Microsoft Office, GIMP Krita software instead of Adobe Photoshop Premiere, and Inkscape instead of Corel Draw as some of the alternatives. And like I said earlier, the cost savings are primarily derived from avoiding the recurring licensing fees for Microsoft and Adobe suites, which have been required for thousands of computers used in the state sector. So KITE has also invested in teacher training so that software and hardware glitches are dealt with locally. The Little Kite IT clubs train around about 180,000 students annually in numerous FOSS-based solutions, a project that is very interestingly now of interest to the Finnish government, who are learning from Kerala, which is also pretty fascinating. So students are enabled to install, use, modify, and share um, software as per the rules outlined by Stallman. And these are Stallman's software freedoms. The freedom one, to run the program as one wishes. Freedom two, to study and change the source code as one wishes. Freedom three, to distribute copies as one wishes. Freedom four, to distribute the improved program. And freedom five, that all distributional licenses must include information on the freedoms and rights of users. Okay. So that principle was taken on board very early in Kerala. Okay. Now, what does this signify? That there is an army of free and open source software enthusiasts in Kerala, many of them in government and in the government sector. And I think they, in a way, they reflect what Christopher Kelty has defined as the kind of the cultural significance of free software. What's the basis for that? And there are two things that he talks about, Christopher Kelty. And he says that free and open source software is about the reorientation of power and knowledge, right? And he says there are two important um, two important concepts here when we talk of free and open source software. One is availability, and the other one is modifiability. And as he says, availability is a broad, diffuse, and familiar issue. It includes things like transparency, open governance, transparent organization, etc. But modifiability includes the ability to not only access, that is to reuse in the trivial sense of using something without restrictions, but to transform it for use in new contexts, to different ends, or in order to participate directly in its improvement and to redistribute or recirculate it with those improvements within the same infrastructures while securing the same rights for everyone. And so I think to a certain extent, Kelty's understanding of of free and open source software is actually reflected in Kerala. And I think it'll be interesting to see with the change of government whether there'll be a change to these systems. But I think in Kerala there's been broad bipartisan support for these types of initiatives. So this is the first example that I wanted to deal with. The second one is on gig worker resistance in India. Okay, and gig worker rights. So, as you know, over the last couple of years, this particular segment, in terms of employment, has become pretty large in different countries around the world, right? And gig worker resistance needs to be seen in the context of this type of employment generated by the platform economy. And of course, most governments see this as a very positive development, right? They see it purely in terms of numbers, right? Now, for example, this is highlighted in a report produced by Niti Aayog, which is the kind of, which is the new planning commission, right? And this report, this 2022 report is entitled India's Booming Gig and Platform Economy. And it estimates that the gig economy workforce of, that is close to 8 million people employed in the sector in 2020 will become 24 million in 2029, right? Massive jump, in terms of numbers. This report celebrates the fact that women and people with disabilities will benefit from this economy, although their welfare will depend on better working conditions, benefits, job securities that this sector lacks. However, it glosses over the fact that workers in the gig economy really are an extension of workers in the unorganized sector, right? A reality that does not call for any celebrations. 90% of the workforce, 600 million in 2026 in India, consists of workers in the informal economy. And that's quite amazing, right? It's only, if you do your readings that you will come to these types of figures and understandings. The fact that 9 out of 10 workers in India are in the informal economy, I think really stands as an indictment of a system that has not been able to expand access to work in the formal economy, right? And so these gig workers are pretty much part of this informal economy. And the problem with the informal economy is that there are very few securities, right? Um, and it's only recently that unions have started playing an important role in this space. So, in December 2025, a few months ago, the Indian Federation for App-Based Transport Workers called a strike for government regulation and better wages that brought 40,000 gig workers onto the streets in major cities in India. And these gig workers work with Zomato, Swiggy, urban companies, Zepto, and other companies. And they had many demands, including the implementation of labor laws for platform workers, the removal of the 10-minute delivery system, and that thankfully is one of the things that has been removed. Right? Government dealt with it and decided that this was too onerous a system, and that the people, many gig workers, delivery boys were getting killed in accidents and all the rest of it, trying to deliver things in 10 minutes. Right? They also pushed for emergency and maternity leave, minimum monthly wage, access to social security benefits, um, replacement of AI-based customer support with human grievance redressal mechanisms, legal recognition of gig workers as workers rather than partners, protection of the right to organize, and the removal of penalties imposed for delivery delays. And this came out in an article written by a person called Mrityunjay in 2026. So, like I said, one of the outcomes of the strike was the banning of the 10-minute delivery that had caused accidents. And that was a reflection of the unreasonable profiteering in the sector of the gig economy. I think there are still many pending demands, including the need to regulate the algorithmic management of gig worker hourly rates and penalties. The interesting thing is, today there are a number of standalone unions that are kind of dedicated to gig worker rights in India. Like, for example, the Ola Uber Drivers and Owners Association and the Telangana Gig and Platforms Workers Union. Right? There are a number of them that have come up in many states in India. And there are also established unions like the All India Gig Workers Union that is associated with the Center for Indian Trade Unions as part of the CPIM. So the fact that you have unions playing a major role has helped gig workers immensely in India. Now, one of the interesting issues with gig workers is that, and gig worker laws, is that there are a few states, Rajasthan being one of them, but also the state of Karnataka, that recently has come up with an interesting gig worker ordinance, Social Security and Welfare Act, that pretty clearly supports gig worker benefits, gig worker securities, etc., etc. And I think this is a very positive step, and I believe that other states will follow in the footsteps of governments of Rajasthan and Karnataka and others. Right? And I think this is an important move, right? In different parts of India. But um, you know what struggles did Greek worker struggles in India? I think what it reflects is the need for basic rights, need for and importantly the need for wages and securities. These are fundamental, right? And it's interesting that much of the literature on gig workers' rights There was, for example, a special section in the International Journal of Communications, 2023, one of the issues. It was kind of dedicated to the understanding of worker resistance in digital capitalism and includes case studies from the Philippines and Indonesia on both formal and everyday resistance. Now, while there is kind of this is a welcome optimism related to some of these struggles. I think the many of these academic studies are typically focused on the subversion of algorithms, on tactical resistance, on cultural struggles, and the like. Now, the International Labour Organization in 2022 had published some data drawn from the Leeds Index of Platform Labor Protest. And they include findings from 1,271 worker protests from around the world. The study includes data from protests in 4 sectors: ride hailing, food delivery, courier services, and grocery delivery. Now, while the methods of protests and repertoires of contention include critical mass rideouts, where large numbers of cyclists ride slowly around a city center, slowing traffic, flash mobs where groups of workers appear suddenly at a venue, such as a company headquarters, and conduct disruptive protests, etc., etc. These types of, the most important types of protests were linked to traditional issues faced by, or basic issues faced by gig workers linked to unions, in particular pay rise, followed by employment status, health, and safety, right? So there's a kind of a disjuncture in terms of what people are focused on in terms of academic work, looking at, for example, cultural struggles, etc., all that kind of stuff, which are important. I'm not saying they're not important. But what workers really require and need at this time, which is basically pay, security, insurance, and so on and so forth. So I think there is a need to factor in the centrality of these basic issues, such as pay, rather than overemphasize novel forms of cultural resistance that do exist but are limited in terms of what they can achieve over the long term. And I quote, "Our findings suggest both notable similarities and differences among platform worker protests across the world. The analysis shows that pay is universally a preeminent concern for platform workers and tends to be the object of protests in all regions of the world. Indeed, the overwhelming presence of pay as a major cause of platform worker protests suggests that we need to be cautious about centralizing issues such as algorithmic control. Moreover, while much scholarship places emphasis on forms of online activity, such as the subversion of algorithms, our findings show that more traditional methods, such as strikes and demonstrations, are also widely used in platform worker protests." Right? In other words, what I'm trying to say is that while Facebook-based solidarities and tactical measures such as algorithmic subversions contribute to everyday resistance, to make a real difference, there is a need for state guaranteed securities, including wages and welfare. Right? That is at the heart of some of these struggles. So that's my second example of gig workers' resistance in India. The third one that I'm going to be dealing with is about Janastu, which is an NGO working in a place called Tumkur. And they're involved in community connectivity projects. Okay. So Janastu is involved in connectivity um, and defined in its kind of multiplicities, not connectivity just in terms of tech connectivity. Right? And what Janastu really does is to prod us to think through the many meanings of connectivity. Real connectivity, imagined connectivity, aspirational connectivity, celebrated in the ambitions of digital India, but is outside the reach of people living in locations where signals are sparse, where the terrain is difficult, cultural traditions and roles strong, especially caste, and where the infrastructures of modernity, such as electricity supply, is notoriously irregular. What does connectivity feel and look like in this context? So Janastu works in a contexts where a source of energy that we take for granted, electricity, and its flows are constrained. This irregularity reflects the history and establishment of infrastructure in both colonial and post colonial India that has traditionally followed a route based on the provisioning of so called tier 1 cities before expanding to other smaller cities. There are, however, notable gaps in the provisionings of infrastructure that are either rudimentary or not present in the remote and inaccessible regions of India. So it's unsurprising that telecommunications connectivity is of limited quality in the hilly areas in which Janastu works in. So it is in this sense that the infrastructural imaginary that is the heart of digital India is only tangentially linked to lives lived in the outskirts of globalizing India, let alone remote India. So Graham and Marvin, who have written one of the better writings on critical infrastructure, have observed, and I quote, infrastructure networks are involved in sustaining what we might call socio-technical geometries of power. And that is true in most parts of India. And this power is reflected in the fact that uninterrupted electricity supplies are guaranteed for the data and cloud centers in Bangalore, along with another resource that is in short supply, water. While those who live on the outskirts of digital India, such as in parts of Tumkur district, are denied the perennial supply of such vital resources. So, in other words, it is clear that the digital divide really is a reflection of other divides faced by communities such as those who live in Halikote and surrounding villages in where Janastu works. So I think a very important aspect of digital justice is access via community connectivity. And I teach a course on community informatics. And one of the examples that I use is that of the NGO Rhizomatica in Mexico. And they work in Chiapas, where they've been involved in capacity building, involved with indigenous communities in creating locally owned and run connectivity projects that are intimately linked with indigenous self-determination and autonomy. Now, this is not possible in India because India is India is a kind of centralized government, and it does not support indigenous self-determination or autonomy, and instead advocates for a one-size-fits-all project and greater assimilation of the indigenous community with the Majoritarian community. Right, that's a reality in India. So in May 2024, while doing some work on a book project on community connectivity, I visited Janastu, that is located in a very hilly area, like I said earlier, in Tumkur, Karnataka. And Janastu is located in a place called Iruve. And this is the map of the Iruve farm that you have there. And Iruve means ants in Kannada. And it is clear why ants figure in the cooperative, creative, communitarian approach to life and work at Janastu. So their annual hacker event is called Anthill Hack. Why? Because ants are consumer builders, and ants always work towards collective goals and solutions. And the principles that animate the community-owned and operated wireless mesh, it's called the cow mesh, are also seen in the life of ants. Right? If their migratory routes are blocked, they will try another. Just as if one node in the cow mesh is disabled, the signal will reroute and find another receptive router to help transmit the signal. Just as ants are resilient, flexible, and resolved, so is the cow mesh, whose functioning is predicated on this ability to reroute, reassess, and restore signal flows and communications. With 6 Libra routers in place, the cow mesh offers connectivity to a handful of villages, although it is a chore to ensure that the routers function effectively. The routers are located in spots that are difficult to access, on the roof of a newly refurbished local municipal building, a good 10 kilometers away, that is in itself located on one of the highest and most advantageous spots for signal flows through a gap in the hills to villages and atop a bamboo transmitting tower closer to Irul. Okay. Now, during my visit, Dinesh, this guy, and his colleagues Shalini and Sashi and I, we piled into a car in the afternoon for a drive up to the mountaintop to repair one of the faulty routers. And you've got some photographs of one of the guys repairing the router. Um, the views were stunning in all directions, as you can see. The router and mesh had to be checked by Shalini and Sashi, followed by wait to ensure that the signal speed was sufficient. The impression that I got was that a lot of the connectivity that is provided by Janastu via the cow mesh enables both offline and online services. The challenge for Janastu is for local communities to actually appreciate um, the 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 value of connectivity, the value of these services, and it's difficult. Partly because of the pressures from the big telecom companies that are there, but also because these are Janastu is a small actor in a region where there are so many other pressures on communities, especially when it comes to connectivity. Um, and I think one of the reasons for Janastu's relative success is because of the fact that they have access to um, um, these alternative tech like Libra routers and Raspberry Pis, and this has enabled the mesh to function optimally. But they also face challenges. They have to replace routers and other tech. And so sustainability is an issue, volunteering is an issue. Of course, these things affect NGOs in general, but they specifically affect small NGOs such as Dhanastha. And I think one of the key things with respect to digital justice today is the availability of community tech that have been designed specifically with the community in mind. And of course, standards such as Wi-Fi, for which a license is not required in countries like India. Now, the issue, of course, with Wi-Fi in India is that a lot of people do not know that they don't require a license, right? And of course, the government keeps mum because they don't want people getting involved in this space called connectivity and actions related to connectivity. So, one of the key things that Janastu does in a context defined by so-called lack of English literacy is the kind of re-narration of familiar genres available on the internet from English to Kannada, which is the local language. And they use, of course, open source software such as Alipay and Suite that enable ordinary people to understand the Minimum Wages Act and the Street Vendors Act, enabling people to comprehend and act upon entitlements that make a qualitative difference in their lives. Okay. Now, one of the issues facing Janastu and other groups like Janastu in India is when communities face a range of sustainability issues, what priority should be given to digital connectivity? Janastu, to some extent, has made a choice to extend connectivity within an approach that also includes women's empowerment and economic well-being, such as support to the making of local crafts. This certainly is a complex choice given limited resources, both human and material. So one of the challenges for organizations such as Janastu is to ensure that local communities come to value their work beyond the initiatives linked to digital connectivity. So there is an effective dimension that plays an important role in community buy-in to these types of projects. The more the community feels that Janastu is cognizant of and responsive to the larger needs of the community, the better their appreciation and acceptance of Janastu and its work in their community. But it is an uphill task, given the deep influences of caste and even empowerment, right, or disempowerment. Right? That is the norm in places like Tumkur, right? Because a lot of people fear what empowerment will do to their, to kids, especially young women. And finally, I want to deal with um, data activisms. Um, Now, over the last couple of years, I've been kind of systematically building, doing work on um, understanding digital infrastructures and issues around digital activism in the country. And my latest book is a book on data centers that we, like Mohan said, will be published in Oxford by Oxford in October. Now, the reason of infrastructure is the great reason of modernization in India, right? And this is why there have been these massive investments made by data centers, um, and increasingly by hyperscalers, big tech companies like Amazon and Google and others. Now, this is happening all over India. This has become a huge issue in many ways. But what's, in the background, what people don't understand is that there's also a major compact between the state and these big data centers. So the reality is that the state does not have storage capacity. So a lot of public sector data is actually migrating to these data centers. And one of the issues that I've dealt with is this whole issue of risk. What happens when public data is kept in private data centers? But the other big issues in India is, of course, is the massive environmental impact of data centers that isn't being discussed as it should be, right? Now, while access to perennial supplies of water and electricity may not be an issue in countries such as New Zealand, it is a massive issue in countries such as India that is keen to become one of the world's kind of data center hubs. So the kind of age of the Anthropocene has been characterized by a growth strategy based on an unmitigated extractivism that has impacted on people's lives and that has turned them into climate refugees, displaced them from their homelands, severing their cultural, social, epistemic continuities with cosmological ways of knowing and apprehending the world. Now, this is happening globally. Tung Hui in his book, A Prehistory of the Cloud, reminds us that beyond the hype of data center exceptionalisms, it remains, and I quote, a resource-intensive, extractive technology that converts water and electricity into computational power, leaving a sizable amount of environmental damage that it then displaces from sight. In the context of the race for AI dominance, this displacement has become even more pronounced. What the photograph that I have, or the screen that I have in front of me, is information about data center activisms in the USA. And this has taken off in the last couple of years. Right? So in the USA, of course, this is the country that has the largest amount of data centers, but it's also concentrated in some places, like, for example, in West Virginia, right? And people in West Virginia have started making a lot of noise about data centers, partly because there have been attempts to rezone, and data centers now are located in places where there are also, habitation, human habitations, and neighborhoods and stuff like that. So data center activisms are now is very strong in Europe. For example, in municipalities in the Netherlands, Dublin City, for example, there's been a moratorium on data centers, and so on and so forth. Even Singapore, I believe, has been involved in issuing temporary moratoria on the siting of data centers. It's big data center activisms in places like Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, but not, funnily enough, as common in India. Now, India, of course, was once described by the writer B.S. Naipaul as he called it a land of a million mutinies. But over the last 2 decades, India has become intolerant to all forms of protest. Right? Today, protests are routinely described as anti-national, and this includes the farmers' protests, the protests against the Citizen Amendment Act, and there have been all sorts of legislations, including some with colonial antecedents, such as the Sedition Law, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, the Indian Judicial Code, Indian Civil Defense Code. All these kinds of things have been used to stifle dissent and put people behind bars. Now, while data center activism in India remains episodic, there are some antecedents, especially the activism connected to the establishment of special economic zones in India and IT corridors. Right? These zones required land, right? And the government used the Draconian Land Acquisitions Act to compulsorily acquire land from ordinary citizens, from farmers, from graziers, from indigenous communities, many of whom did not have formal land ownership papers. In the context of censorship and the elevation of data centers to critical infrastructure status, it is beyond any questioning, just like the nuclear industry. There have, however, been a few examples of data center activisms, specifically by communities who fear groundwater depletion and who are confronted with the opacity and lack of transparency from both the industry and the state. So, water stress that is, of course, felt in cities throughout the country is bound to impact on communities living on the peripheries of data centers. And I predict that this will become a very contested issue in the years to come. There have been some activisms in some parts of, in Rajasthan, in some parts of North India, but these are kind of limited precisely because data centers are seen as a critical infrastructure. And so you can't kind of protest against these data centers. And if you do, you can be put behind bars. Now, one of the, I think, big issues in India is that many of these data centers have been given a holiday from all the key laws, all the key legislations, right? They don't have to abide by labor laws. They don't have to abide by pollution laws, all these kinds of things. So, and I think this particular slide is from the state of Telangana, and they seem to have been the worst culprit when it comes to giving a holiday to data centers. Now, there are major issues here because if you look at the number of acts that they exempt from, right, data centers are exempt from the purview of statutory power cuts, they are exempt from the Maternity Benefit Act, the Contract Labor Act, the Payment of Wages Act, and it goes on and on and on. Right? It basically means that these data centers can exploit their workers. Right? And this is really problematic because I think there are very few countries in the world, that kind of have given this kind of a holiday for data centers. Right? And so I believe that things like David Harvey's concept of accumulation by dispossession can be used to understand contemporary dispossessions in India. Now, the four examples of data justice and struggles around data justice are by no means exhaustive. There are many data justice struggles that remain local and unrecorded. Right? The fact that such struggles exist in the context of an authoritarian politics remains a testament to the resilience of ordinary Indians. So, in conclusion, just a few points. Right? One, in spite of attempts to use digital public infrastructure to control populations, there are many counter manifestations of the digital. Right? And this is happening all over India. There are many transgressions. The only thing is these need to be recorded. These need to be investigated and these need to be written about. Secondly, this is specifically the case in a country where 90% of the workforce is in the informal economy, a context in which these digital transgressions are many and varied, right? So that history of the kind of so-called Jugad economy, right, the informal economy, must include the way in which local people, the informal labor workers actually deal with the digital, right? And I think they're dealing with it in many interesting and provocative ways, right? They are involved in modifying the tech. There is skilled labor there to do this kind of stuff, and there is, I think, the development of a knowledge at that level, and that can be kind of shared to strengthen data justice in India. Thirdly, data justice related struggles are aimed at curbing data exceptionalisms and making the conditions for data-centered work on a par with work in the formal economy. So that's one of the key issues, right? So if you look at what gig workers are doing, that's what they're doing. They are pushing for, for workers' rights on a par with workers in the formal economy. Right? And I think that's an important struggle. Fourthly, struggles linked to digital justice are not always standalone struggles. but are linked to other struggles related to cultural, social, economic, and political rights. Again, extraordinarily important that this is taken seriously. These are not standalone struggles. These are connected to other survival issues, right? And I think when NGOs like Janastu get into this area, they really need to think of how they're going to be dealing with those other survival issues as well, not just the connectivity issues. And finally, the role of the state. Now, the role of the state in India is, I've written about this, can be very ambivalent, right? They can support some really interesting connectivity projects, and at the same time, they can stifle dissent, etc., etc. But some states like Kerala have done their homework and have made a difference in the lives of people. And that's very important. Just as the governments in Rajasthan and Karnataka have pushed for digital, gig workers' rights, again, very important. At the same time, you know, so we need to recognize the fact that the state can play this kind of ambivalent role. So in the long run, I think there needs to be more stories of positive stories of digital justice in India. People are, at a variety of levels involved in contesting the state, contesting big tech, contesting, coercive laws, and making voices being heard. The issue of, for example, Dalit influences and stuff like that. Right? Those are really important stories, and I believe that the time has come to for somebody to write a proper narrative on these types of digital justice struggles in India. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Pradeep, for that really comprehensive journey across the spaces of India, in particular, in terms of the various forms of resistance to the uh, digital architectures and articulating justice in that sense. So we will open up the floor to questions. There is a lot of excellent content for us to engage in. Please feel free to place your message on the YouTube channel in the comment section. I'll be able to see that here, or on the Facebook page. I will go ahead and start with a question, Pradeep, in terms of the concept of resistance and how you theorize it. You rightfully point out the limitation, if you will, of the much of the literature around micro practices, or what would be framed as cultural practices of resistance, vis-a-vis worker organizing collective practices. I would love for us to think through a little bit of that, some more, particularly in terms of unions, in terms of the political project of the left. Since this is a talk on digital futures, what do you think are the architectures of hope?
I definitely think in the context of especially gig workers, um, states in India play a very important role. There's no question. Individual states really have to come up with, these statutory legislations that provide support for gig workers, because I don't think anybody else can do that. Civil society can't do that. You can't expect industry to do that. The industry always says that they will do this and that, and they come up with certain provisions, but those provisions are weak. They're not implemented. They're not operationalized. And therefore, I think in the context of digital futures, especially in the context of a country like India, where we have literally millions of people who are working in the informal sector, you I can't think of the state not playing a part in digital justice projects, both from a national level and from at local levels, right? So I think this is fundamental. Um, Anything else, NGOs working and all, these are all going to be very localized in small areas. And they're important work. I'm not denying the work that they do, but they're all limited in some ways, right? Whereas the government, the state has got has the kind of resources to make a difference in the lives of these people. So I think, a basic wage, really important. I think they are asking for, I think, 20 or 30,000 rupees a month as a basic wage. And of course, social securities, really important for them, especially insurance and things like that. And also ensuring that, the companies like Swiggy and others treat them as workers, not as partners and stuff like that. Because there's been a lot of kind of regulatory arbitrage, right, by these big companies trying to, dealing with loopholes in the law and trying to make it, as difficult and onerous as possible for their so-called partners to, to get, to get wages, and using algorithmic control and all this kind of stuff. And this is commonplace in different parts of the world. But I really think that, you really need to have strong legislations, right? And the implementations of these legislations. I think the unions also play an important role in this space, but in the context of gig workers, I think the unions were pretty late coming onto the stage, right? The big unions. It was, it was, gig workers started their own unions. These were not recognized and things like that. Although at the moment, because of large numbers of people joining these unions, it is slowly has that recognition, and the big unions are actually getting involved in the act as well. So these are all positive signs, I think. But I think, I think the issue in India, like I said, is this the whole issue of the the fact that so many millions of people live in the informal economy and work in the informal economy. That I find is extraordinary. I mean, just think of, I mean, I can't even imagine 600 million people, out of the 600 million workers, that 90% of them are in the informal economy. And that is hugely problematic. And this is why, it's been a very slow process for governments to recognize the fact that you have these 90% of people who don't have any social security at all, who are working in that space, right? All the attention has been on the 10%, right? So, who else can get involved in providing data, digital justice? It has to be the state. It has to be unions making a, you know, you know, ensuring that these people get justice. But really, I mean, apart from them, I can't think of anybody else. I really can't think of the corporates coming into the space, or, you know, um, corporate social responsibility making a difference and all the rest of it, because those are all, there's all, greenwashing and all this kind of stuff that is happening. So yeah, that's my take on this one. You probably have better options here. It's a
No,
tough
I
one.
don't have better options. I do have some questions, and that is, from where I hear you going, you are offering, if you will, an imaginary of the state. And again, thinking of our framing around digital futures. So,
Yeah.
what is potentially an imagination of a state that is socialist when sort of you look at the electoral performances and you look at the performance of the CPM, which really is a social democratic party, much more so than, say, the Congress, whose architecture, in a nutshell, is neoliberal. But then you look at the electoral performance of the left within that context, that seems to not be so well. So, if your imagination is to construct a just state, to me, it sounds like it is the construction of a socialist state or a social democratic state. How do we get there? What are the processes to get there in the Indian context, given the current scenario and the performance of the left?
Wow, big issues, one really big one. Um, yeah, I think, the way I see it is that the recent setbacks, for example, in Kerala, I think these are temporary. I mean, like, you have these cycles, right? These electoral cycles. Anti-incumbency is big. I mean, if you look at Tamil Nadu, it's very fascinating because, the DMK government actually had done pretty well in terms of the economy and all the rest of it. And yet there was an anti-incumbency thing against them, right? So I think you can look at it both in the context of a socialist state um, that is probably possible in one or two states in India at this particular moment in time, but also in terms of what um, individuals can do. I think what is fascinating in India is that you do have these interesting civil servants, right? Who who are who have a kind of socialist bent and who can do things like this guy Uma Shankar, right? Who was an evangelist for force. He was an IAS officer, right? He went into he got into trouble with the government in Tamil Nadu, and then he was shunted here and there, and then he left, and now he's back, I think, again. But there are people like him, right, who can make a difference. So if he gets involved, if there are good civil servants involved in policy making on the digital, you can make a difference at some level or the other. Now you may not have a socialist state. You might, but you might have individuals who are playing a significant role in pushing for a certain alternative understanding of what the digital should mean, right? And access to the digital should mean. That kind of thing, I think, is more realistic, in a place like India. And again, I'm not saying that, so basically, if you look at the civil service in India and civil servants, you're only going to find a handful of them who who are going to kind of make this kind of a difference. But that handful is going to be really important. They are people that we need to cultivate, right? We need to support. They are people that NGOs need to support and civil society needs to support. You work with them and things can happen, right? Now, the big state, oh man, think of India. It's very difficult to, this juggernaut of the Sangh Parivar and all the rest of it. It's I'm not very optimistic about that, right? Because you can see the very what's there, systematic ways in which this juggernaut is taking bits and pieces of India, right? I mean, what's happened in West Bengal is fascinating, and all the rest of it, right? But the I think if we go down the state capture route, I don't know how long this is going to take. What I'm saying is we have to celebrate, uh, you know, what should I say, the ambivalent state. Some states doing really interesting work. We have to celebrate the, you know, when Karnataka gets involved in pushing for a gig workers bill. That's an interesting thing in itself. So you're going to have these bits and pieces, right? They're not always going to be what you know the solutions are not always going to be democratic and all the rest of it, right? You know Solutions are not always going to be in favor of social justice. These kinds of things, they're not going to be there, but there will always be some like that, right? And that is what I think we can, we should actually, you know investigate, make a case for, bring it out in the public. Not many people, for example, know about force-based solutions in Kerala, and they should, right? If the way I look at it is that if a state has been able to um, save 350 million US dollars from license fees, why the hell shouldn't other states in India, take on board that kind of a solution? It makes economic sense. It makes social sense, and stuff like that. So I think some of these examples need to be, you know, I think people need to write a lot more about it and make it public, so that there's a recognition that there are opportunities and possibilities. People have, some states have already done things that have made a difference, right? That needs to be democratized, I think. So, anyway, you know about unions better than I do, Mohan, and the power of unions, right? Unions can make a huge difference, but I think they were late coming on to this
Yeah.
whole informal sector thing. So,
And sort of in the Indian context, in my humble understanding, there are sort of two the critical points of engagement I have with unions. One is the extent of the union space has been taken over by Hindutva
right,
and far right nationalist elements. So that a culturalist narrative, if you will, has taken over rather than working class politics. And the
Yeah,
other seems to be, like you point out, the absence of organizing of gig workers and the informal economy. But more broadly, it seems like um, the absence of the ability to interface with the poor and the
yeah,
very marginalized and the Dalit and Adivasi communities in a way that interfaces with left politics. So those
absolutely.
would be my two critical points.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think the country is living in difficult times, right? Where the resources that you cannot compete with the resources that the Sangh Parvar has got, right?
Yeah,
They have huge resources. They've got human resources. They've got financial resources, and it's these resources make a difference, right? They've got large pockets, and they can engage with these communities, and they've also have they've got the backing of the RSS and these and massive all India wide networks, right? So this is the old Congress style. They had all this in the past, right? In the 50s and 60s. They don't have it because Mrs. Gandhi systematically dismantled that system,
yeah,
right? And so, and these people are doing exactly the same thing now. So anyway.
yeah. So Pradeep, I want to build on this toward the question of policy a little bit because you touched upon policy. So you look at India as a national case, and then you offered us four different case studies.
Mm.
Um, Now, if you look at the platform architecture in a global context, what are the kinds of policy solutions that one might work toward, particularly in terms of South solidarity, in terms of community to community solidarity, in terms of, say, for instance, these communities that are now facing resource starvation because of this water cooling systems that are being built into the communities, right? So, what are the possibilities in terms of challenging global tech? Again, it's just a massive structure with uh, immense power consolidated globally. But we have also seen, the power of South-South solidarity, the power of people's movements in challenging these global structures. So, are there lessons that we can bring from, say, the 60s and 70s into the contemporary moment?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, I- just look at the history of India, Mohan. I mean, it's fascinating history, right? Especially in terms of activisms. You look at the activisms from the 60s and 70s and 80s, and they were amazing, right? There were so many different types of activisms across the country, and yet, you know, in 2026, 2026, and we see, we don't see a massive amount of those types of activisms. Partly because the governments have become a lot more, they don't like dissent, and they put people behind bars and stuff like that. So it's a lot more difficult for people to actually um, to voice their opinion, to come out on the streets and things like that. There's a lot of surveillance and things like that. But having said that, I think there's a lot of learnings that we can also have from outside of India, right? In places like Brazil, in places like Uruguay, in Chile, and all these places, ordinary people have taken up the fight against data centers, right? And they're not taking this up because of the fact that they don't like data centers. I mean, I don't think there's any issue with data centers because you have to store data somewhere, right? The issue really is about the fact that many of these data centers there's no transparency and accountability, and the state is in hock with them, right? And therefore, a lot of people feel that they're not getting clear information on, for example, how much of water is used by a data center, whether that will lead to the depletion of groundwater, whether that will impact on resources at a local level, right? Water, or for example, power, right? Again, most of these cities in India are, water scarce and power scarce, right? So how do we learn from these um, activisms that are there in the global south, in places like Brazil, in places like Well, Africa doesn't have much, maybe South Africa, but I think South America has got the most amount of activisms around data centers, but also in the global north. I think places like Dublin, for example, Ireland, right? They've been very interesting in terms of how they've taken on board big tech, right? Very clear in terms of their messaging to big tech, right? And I think so we can learn from those as well. But surely, I mean, the way I see it is that data sector activisms in India are bound to grow because of the fact that you already feel, and a lot of communities in India feel that these data centers are uninvited. They are now part of local neighborhoods, and therefore there's going to be a impact on groundwater and power and all that kind of stuff, right? So this is bound to. I mean, I can predict that in the next couple of years there's going to be a lot of data center activisms in India.
Thank you for that. Now, can we sort of build on this, Pradeep, to think through a little bit in terms of antitrust laws, for instance, or the power consolidation of big tech? Like, if you think about the largest tech corporations or platform corporations, you sort of boil it down to about five. And then when you look at AI corporations, you boil it down to three.
Mm.
So, within that context, what is the room and space for aspects like, policy movements around antitrust laws, sort of capping the size of big tech, those kinds of movements that can connect both the global south with the global north, and then find entry points into the policy architectures, if you will, of the global north, including in the US, which is sort of one of the key sites where these infrastructures are playing out.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to start off, with the fact that big tech is entangled with the state all over the world. Every state in the world is entangled with big tech, right? In major or minor ways, but mostly in major ways, right? At every level. If you look at these four big companies, right? I mean, their tentacles are like vast, right? The state sector is completely involved in it. Completely involved. I mean, when you look at, for example, data center migrations, it's clear. All our health data in Telangana and all that public data is going into these private data centers. Right? So we've already been entangled. All the states are entangled. What do you do in that context is the issue, right? Smaller states have no chance at all. There's nothing you can do with these big tech guys. Bigger states, I think, like India, if they want to, they can take a stance. But you need to have the right politics, right? And I don't think at the moment we have the right politics. Now, again, we can think of individual states in India taking a stance. But even that is difficult because they're all entangled with big tech, right? And at the moment, data centers are being invited. Every state has got a data center policy. They're inviting them to come. They're giving them tax holidays. They're giving them holidays from all legislations and stuff like that, right? So we are in that kind of a situation, right? But I think every now and then a state comes. For example, Australia has been recently, has been pushing for a ban on, youngsters below 16 having access to mobile phones and all this kind of stuff. Interesting. I mean, will it succeed? I don't know, right? But it's an interesting, what should I say, initiative in a context in which most states have they won't even touch the big tech, right? And Australia is a small country, there's only 25 million people here. The fact that they can do that sends a sign that these people are not immune, right? Now, the only other region that does this is the EU. I think the EU has got some very interesting policies with respect to big tech, right? Things like, say, the right to be forgotten. All these things are, I think, really fascinating. Now, again, they have to operationalize and implement these policies. But they really are, they're really important initiatives, right? Now, even in the US, despite the fact that the US is a country where, it would seem that big tech is celebrated by everybody, there are lots of people, especially, in congressional levels, who are against big tech's dominance, right? So you see, some kinds of activities in the US as well, trying to curb big tech. I think when Lena Khan was at the who was at the commission, the FTC, I think she was trying to make a case for curbing big tech, right? And and breaking big tech, right? And these are interesting, these are interesting developments as well, right? So um, I think there are no clear answers to those kinds of issues, Mohan. Um, I think what you find is that I think regions like the EU have done the most in terms of throwing down the gauntlet to big tech. But the problem, of course, is that even when when Google pays the EU, a couple of $1 million or $1 billion for an infringement, it's not big for Google, right? Google makes that kind of money every day, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, how do you kind of how do you kind of curb them in ways that really affects their business proposition, right? That's the key thing. How do you do that? That business proposition is the problem, right? The fact that they control, you know, sociality, commerce, search, right? Everything is in their hands, right? That makes them kind of invincible, right? But I really think that you have to chip away in small ways, right? And if there is ever an opportunity for, like, say, for example, BRICS nations to come together, I think the Brazilians are doing pretty well here. The Brazilians, I think, pulled up Twitter, X, right? And I think Lula a couple of months ago basically gave them an ultimatum. He said, like, either you stay here or go. so so they were in that position never before that they had to deal with Lula, right? But Lula comes with a certain politics that we know, right? And not too many of our friends have the same politics. That's the issue, right? So, but if in the context of BRICS, someone like Lula, the South Africans, Indians, who knows about the Indians, if these guys can come together and make a make a statement, that'll be wonderful. I mean, the Indians in the if you look at the UPA regime in the old days, they were involved in a tax thing, right? They were involved in that what is it called? I've written about it. There was a Google tax that India was
Yeah.
involved in, right? Very important. Those are examples of a country hitting back at these people making huge amounts of profits, being in a third country, not paying any taxes, all this kind of stuff, right? So there are initiatives, these types of initiatives, but I think we need a kind of a regional backing like BRICS or something like, to make a difference. I think if those countries can come together and say, look, we need more alternatives, we need to have better environments, digital environments and stuff like that, that might make a difference.
Mm. Thank you, Pradeep. There is a question. We have about 7 minutes,
Okay.
and there is a question from our colleague Sai Taffel, whose work on the digital and the ecological is really inspiring. And Sai asks, inspirational story, are there plans for other regions in India to implement similar IT strategies? So that question of scaling up, I think, is an interesting question.
Yeah, I don't know at the moment. I think, like I said, some states, so this is done sectorally, right? At the moment, when I look at gig workers, I think there's, some of the states, are getting involved in creating legislations and stuff like that. Partly because at a national level, there is nothing much happening. So the individual states in India are creating legislation. Also because these gig workers are becoming, a large part of their employment base in every state, right? They're also going to be a voter base, right? So they've got to ensure that their needs are taken care of. But that I think is a good thing, right? So this is a kind of a bottoms up process, a recognition that these workers are in their midst and that they can make a difference, and therefore, and also, I think there's no reason why they shouldn't be given social securities on a par with people in the informal employment, right? So that's happening in in many parts of India, and I think that's a great thing. I think everything else in terms of digital justice is what should I say? It's like these are there are many initiatives, but they're all many of them are small scale. I think one of the interesting things is, what's going to make a difference? Is it going to be the small scale ones or the big scale ones? The ones from the state, right? I think we need both, right? Partly because the state has got, has maximum amount of resources, right? And NGOs don't have that. So we have to recognize the fact that that's a reality, right? And I think, but more work needs to be done in those spaces. So
Great. My last question, Pradeep, which is sort of along the lines of the delineation between civil society and worker organizing and potentials of intersections. The reason I ask this, in my own work, I've written about the extent to which civil society has been co opted within the free market economic
mm.
structure,
Yeah, yeah.
including terms and concepts such as participation that have been thoroughly incorporated into serving things like World Bank projects. That has, in many ways, depleted the capacity of communities to actually resist fascism when it comes in full form.
Yeah.
So in some ways, I understand there's a need to see multiple forms of resistance and building bridges with each other. And at the same time, much of civil society, in the context of the historic organizing of the left, and this has been my empirical experience, is sort of has been driven toward depleting or undermining the organizing capacity of the left. You know, so that you have a civil society definition of the left, which is not always in synergy with working class and left party definition of left within that context. So I guess my question is, in terms of worker organizing, particularly in the question of a left politics with a capital L, because one might argue that in the face of fascism and sort of tech fascism, if you will, the only place of resistance is in the organized left in a capital L sense. I mean, that is one line of argument. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, remember that one of the big issues that has affected the civil society today is um, a heavy-handed approach by the government, right? Especially on things like FCRAs, right? The fact that they can't get monies from outside and things like that really has impacted on a number of NGOs. Not only the big ones like, I think Amnesty and Greenpeace and others are disallowed in India. They don't no longer operate. But also a number of other um, NGOs who are doing some very interesting work, who are getting monies from here and there and all the rest of it, but doing some pretty radical work. Right? Now, you can look at it both ways. One is FCRA clearance was no question that it was used by some of these crazy, Christian organizations and Islamic ones. But fascinating enough, I think some of the Hindutva ones have got away. They can be part of FCRA, but not the others, right? They can get monies through them, but not the others, which is crazy. I think nuts. But I think the reality is that many of these, so FCRA is a bit of a, two-edged kind of thing, right? On the one hand, it allowed many civil society organizations to function, be radical, all the rest of it. At the same time, it allowed all these other nutters to come in, all these guys, with conversion and all this kind of stuff, right? There were many of them. And I've written about these guys in the past. And especially of these evangelical lots. I did a chapter on one group called Gospel for Asia from Kerala. I mean, he was getting this guy, KP Yohanan was getting 700 and 800 crores a year from outside kind of thing, right? For his evangelization also. So there are all those problems, right? And I think you're right. I think civil society has always had a problematic relationship with the left, with especially organized left, right? And of course, the organized left also has a problem with them, right? So this is the kind of so this has been going on for many years, right? Partly because the organized left has been involved in kind of bread and butter issues. These people have taken on board kind of intersectional issues and stuff like that, right? Which is seen as problematic and stuff like that. So that has played its own part, that whole thing. Um, I End of the day, I'm with groups who are dealing with those bread and butter issues, because end of the day, I don't know what you think of it, Mohan. I really think it's a living wage. It's about employment. It's about security. Those are the fundamental things, and all these other things that are important are less important, right? And in a country like India, we have to deal with those fundamental, you know, basic issues that are related to survival, right? And if the organized left is doing that, hats off to them. That's the way it should go, right? And I think this is where the rub is, right? And I think we need to recognize the wood for the trees, right? This is the key thing. Whereas a lot of people run with the fashions, they do cultural stuff, they do this thing, that thing. That is, I mean, it's good. I mean, everyday activisms, and I believe in all that. I come from that thing, right, of believing in all these kinds of things. But, when push comes to shove, and you're forced to, take sides on what issues most important, absolutely critically important, then I'd say it's bread and butter issues, right? How do you give people a good quality of life, right? How do you give them a living wage? These are the fundamental issues, I think. Everything else is anyway. That's my own limitations, I guess. But come on.
You're singing to the choir, or you're preaching to the choir.
Anyway,
Yeah, since we are having this conversation from here in Aotearoa, and for you in Aboriginal land, I want to wrap up with the concept of data sovereignty. Here in Aotearoa, I think that the Maori-led movement on data sovereignty and
yeah,
indigenous data sovereignty is a powerful exemplar of a policy axis through which you can enter this conversation and debate. And I think there is um, much opening for how we imagine the future in that sense too.
absolutely. I've got a chapter on this in my book on data centers, whole issue of data center democratization, and I've
Yeah,
looked at indigenous data sovereignties, especially in New Zealand and in Canada, which is a very interesting thing that's happening there. But again, the issue is what kind of data, right?
yeah,
You know, is it going to be all transactional data or only customary data, whatever that kind of stuff. It's an
yeah.
interesting space, very interesting
Yes,
space.
and in the Indian context, where do we even begin that
Uh,
conversation on Adivasi data sovereignty, right?
yeah. I mean, we have those data registers in places like
Yeah,
in Telangana with the
mm,
Deccan Development Society and things like that.
yeah,
That's a start, right?
yes,
Um, I think some of that data needs to be local. So I make a case in that book for um, data centers at the level of this private sector, the public sector, and civil society. So, and that's my last chapter. So,
wow. And that is a chapter of hope and
yeah,
imagination.
hopefully, let's see what comes up. Anyway,
Pradeep, thank you so much for joining us. It's been such an honor to have this conversation with you, and really all the best with your book, and can't wait to read it. If you send me the link to where we can find your book, I will also post this on our platforms.
thank you so much. One,
Great.
all the
Take
best.
care, and
Thank you.
thank you to our audience for joining. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye. Bye bye.